You start? Okay. So good morning and welcome after a week's break. So my name is Brato and I'm going to be talking about this module 2, which I've called Life and Flows at Low Reynolds Numbers. So I will just briefly outline what this module is going to be. It's going to be about understanding primarily swimming of microorganisms and their collective behavior in fluidic environments. And for this, there are really two pieces. One is the mechanics of the fluid dynamics piece, for which I give you a handout, and I will also go over this today. And then we will try to apply these in specific problems. So one thing that I thought I should mention, since it's very different from what Akshit covered, I thought I will just give you a brief motivation of why you should care about this sort of stuff, why it's interesting, and what are the problems that people think of. Okay. So let me start by giving you this example. This is, there is a mouse. Okay. Okay, let me start by giving you this example. This is a picture that all of you have seen over here. It is the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. And we all know that this serves as a depiction of the divine proportions of the human body. It says that roughly our height is same as a wingspan. And this is over here is a picture of a fly, where you can also see certain proportions and symmetries appearing in the body of the fly. Now the question is, apart from these symmetries, there is also another symmetry that this picture portrays, and that's a bilateral symmetry, or the left-right symmetry that we all have on the outside. But there is a saying that symmetry is really only skin deep. If you look underneath the skin, then you find that we are not really left-right symmetric, and our organs are not placed in a symmetric fashion. In fact, our heart is on the left side, the liver is on the right side, and so on and so forth. Some people can actually have their entire body plan flipped like a mirror, that's called situs inversus, and can still function normally. In fact, we all have three broken symmetries. One is top-down, the other is front-back, the other is this left-right symmetry that I'm talking about. And the last symmetry to be broken in the process of development is this left-right symmetry that I'm mentioning. Now, since humans start off as a spherically symmetric egg, it's sort of spherically symmetric embryo. It's sort of a fundamental question that how do you break this symmetry in the process of development? And one of the most remarkable discoveries in developmental biology has been unraveling of this mechanism through which you break this left-right symmetry that we all have in the outside. So what people did is that they looked at this mouse embryo, and the mouse embryo, there is a chamber they found is called Henson's node, or left-right organizer. Don't worry about the name, it's not important for the mechanism. What they noticed is that in this node, there are thin hair-like micron-sized filaments that you see over there, and they're called cilia that are rotating vigorously. So I'll just give you a picture. There are hundreds of such filaments, there are many cells in these nodes. Each of the cells has this one thin hair-like object, and it's rotating clockwise. Okay, it's just whirling around. Now think of it as a coffee cup. So if you take a spoon, and if you stir with one spoon, you will mix the fluid, right? You will create a directional flow. But you will only create directional flow if all of these things are beating in some sort of coherence. If they're all doing their own random things, then there won't be any directional flow. So it turns out they do beat in coherence. And what they do is that they create a flow that go from the right-hand side to the left-hand side of the chamber. So there are some particles that you see going from right to left, and that's this flow is doing. Now the hypothesis is that this flow then interacts with chemical messengers on either side of the chamber, and these interactions eventually lead to the symmetry breaking of the embryo. Now this is all hypothesis, but what's quite remarkable is that people who figured this out went back, and what they did is that they designed an experiment where they will mechanically, just like coffee spoon, stir the fluid in the other direction. So they stirred the fluid from left to right instead of going from right to left. And quite remarkably, the heart of the mouse ended up on the other side. So that's flipped the direction of the symmetry. So if this does not prove that why fluid flows are important in biology, I don't know what does. But what this also, okay, I will. So what this also tells us is, what this also tells us is a fundamental point that I'm trying to make over here, which is that there is an intrinsic coupling between mechanics or fluid flows with functions. Okay, so oftentimes what happens is that you have mechanics like fluid flows that I'm talking about, and they're always related to some sort of function. In this case, the function was left-right symmetry breaking. It could be something else as well. And in almost all these cases, something that sits in between is biochemistry. So just like fluid flows interact with chemical messengers in this problem, they can interact with other sort of signals in the problem, and then can create functions. So you cannot really ignore one from the other, and they are all intrinsically coupled. Okay, so this is a bit more provocative and maybe oversimplified, but I should also point out that these three things together has implications for evolution. Okay, so what I mean by that, I will just give you through an example. You know that when life started, it started as a single cell. It started in an aquatic environment, but at some point it became multiple cells, right? It became 2, 4, and then it's complex, where now the cells are differentiated, they have different functions and so on. Now you can ask that, why did this happen, right? Why did cells why did they become multiple cells? What was the origin of multicellularity? It turns out that, of course, it has complex questions of biochemistry and functions, but whenever you think of functions, or whenever you're thinking of evolutionary pressure for something to attain or achieve something, you need to think about mechanics, because they are living in an environment and you cannot really separate out mechanics from function. And in this context, fluid flows, or in broader sense, elasticity and all the other subjects come into play, and they all together can shed light on questions like evolution. So this is sort of the broad motivation or the big picture, but of course we have to do something that's concrete in this course. So what I've chosen to do is to talk about flows and sort of life at lower Reynolds number, or flows and life at micron scales. So the reason for choosing this subject is something, of course, I'm interested in, and I work on this sort of tangentially, but also these are really abundant problems. What I mean by abundance is that, microorganisms, even though we are not seeing them with our naked eyes, but they are really one of the largest contributors to the biomass. They're abundant. They're all over the place. They're in our gut, in aquatic environments, in soil, they're everywhere. And so it's a natural question, or sort of a question out of curiosity: how are these guys moving? What are they doing? How they're functioning? So here are some examples of problems that I would like to think about in this course. So this is an E. coli, which is a bacteria that swims in fluid by this run and tumble motion. They have this flagella, they rotate it, they move around. This is a green algae, Chlamydomonas, and it has again these two thin hair-like filaments called flagella. They're beating it and performing breaststroke-like motions, and this helps them again to swim in fluids. This is a sperm cell, okay, it's propagating bending waves along its flagella, again a long floppy object. And with the propagation of these waves, it's swimming in fluids. And this is a much larger organism. It's called Volvox, and it has roughly 50,000 cells. They're spherically symmetric, as you can see over there. And they're a prototypical organism in the question of sort of understanding how multicellularity emerge. So they have a lot of ciliated cells on the outside surface. They together perform various coordinated action. And when you have multiple Volvox, they perform all sort of collective behavior. Okay? So in all these problems, if you think about it, the flows or the mechanics is happening outside the cell. So say the cell is moving and it's disturbing the fluid around it. So that's why I'm calling this external flow problems. However, there is a whole class of problems which relies to flows internal to things, okay? And again at the micron scale. And really the most prominent example is flows inside cells. So we have roughly 30 trillion cells in human, and just for the numbers, there are about 100 billion stars in Milky Way, so it's ridiculously large compared to that number. So inside cells, what can happen is that you can again have flows. This is flows inside plant cells called eloda, and this is what is called cyclosis or cytoplasmic streaming, where these large-scale flows transport chloroplast in these very large cells. This is the first cell division in C. elegans, and here this is formation of mitotic spindle. So this is an apparatus that help you in formation of cells. And again, there is a very rich set of questions of mechanics and fluid flows involved in this formation of cell division problems. This is an example, a movie of flows inside egg cells or oocytes of the fruit fly Drosophila. And again, you see that there is a lot of complicated motions happening over here, and there are really things, if you image the things or the fluid flows, they really look like hurricanes or vortices, even though their physics and governing equations are fundamentally very different. And finally over there, it's an example of, it's just a picture, it's of a crawling amoeba, and you're looking at the flows inside the cells. So all of these examples take place at the scales of micron. The flows are very slow, oftentimes the fluids are very viscous, and this is the world that I'm going to talk about. Okay. So this is a rough outline of the model. So today I will primarily talk about fluid mechanics, and so that we are all on the same page to understand certain specific problems of biophysics. I just have one disclaimer or one point that I want to make, is that first, that this is not a course on fluid mechanics. So I will purposefully not be rigorous about the stuff that I talk about fluids. So the whole idea of doing fluids here is to get an understanding so that we can do certain problems in biophysics. So don't take any of my word as standard for fluids. That's one thing. The second disclaimer is that this is the first time I'm teaching this. So I most likely will happen to go either very slow or very fast. So you guys need to stop me and tell me what I'm doing. Okay, so that's your responsibility that you have to do. And there is really no goal to reach the end. Really, I genuinely mean that I don't need to really cover all these things. If we reach, very good. If we have more time, we can do something else. But if we don't reach, that's fine. We should just learn as we go along. That should be the goal. Okay? Do you have any questions so far? Questions? Okay. So let me just stop this, and I will now use the board. So as I mentioned, that today's lecture is primarily fluids. Depending on whether we have time, we will get to biology or not. Maybe we start from next lecture. But what I want to do is I want all of you guys to get familiarized with the world that we're going to talk about, the properties of that world, and sort of the strangeness and oddness of that world. So I sent out a video. If you guys have seen the video, you've already seen some of the weird things that happens in this world of micron scale. We'll learn more about it. So let me start with Navier-Stokes equations. Okay. And what these equations are going to describe is going to describe fluid flows. And whenever we're describing fluid flows, like I mentioned in the handout, it's always good to talk about a velocity field. So I'm going to denote my velocity field with U. I will try to denote vectors by an underscore. Okay, so U is my velocity field, X is my position, and T is time. And throughout this course, I'm going to talk about fluids that have constant density and that are incompressible. So there is no variation of the density or viscosity as you move along the fluid. So they have all uniform and constant properties. And if for such a fluid, if you have incompressibility, you have this condition. The velocity field U is divergence free. So this is the divergence. And the Navier-Stokes equation looks like this. And if we just define what I mean by delta, delta is simply, I'm doing this in reference to some coordinate system. So this is our governing set of equations of any fluid flows that we're going to think of. Okay, so let me just go over what these equations encode and what every term means. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first term is really a statement of incompressibility. So if you have a fluid, so if you take, when you're thinking about fluid, you typically think about a blob of fluid. So you take some volume element of the fluid. So this is some region of the fluid flow, and you say that the volume of this fluid, as it moves around, is not allowed to change. And then what you get is this condition of divergence of U is 0, because the flux of material leaving out of the surface is really U dot the local normal times ds, and you do this integral over delta omega. But now you apply the divergence theorem on this, and then this becomes divergence of U over the volume element in this region omega. And this is true for any arbitrary volume. and this has to be equal to 0 because I'm saying that the volume is not changing. This is the amount of stuff leaving the object. And I've said the net stuff, the net volume doesn't change, so this has to be 0. And only way this can be 0 for any arbitrary volume dV is that if del dot u, the divergence itself is 0. So that's the statement of incompressibility, that as this fluid blob is moving around, it's not going to change its volume. Okay. So over here, which is really the crux of the Navier-Stokes equations, this is really, you should think of it as momentum balance or writing Newton's laws of motion. Okay. So we know that the Newton's laws of motions are simply, I will just write it this way, F is ma, and this is exactly F is equal to ma. Okay. So on the left hand side, I have essentially, so let me erase this Laplacian here. So on the left hand side, this whole thing sitting over here is acceleration of the fluid element, and this is density. So density times acceleration is essentially mass times acceleration, but per unit volume. Is that okay with everyone? So this is like mass times acceleration altogether, but per unit volume, you should remember that. And this is acceleration, of course, and you can recognize that this is acceleration because there is a term that looks like derivative of my velocity field with respect to time. So that's exactly like acceleration. But then there is this additional piece that shows up in this equation. And in the handout, I showed you that where this additional piece comes from. Okay, this really comes from following an element of the fluid as it moves along. And that's why it's sometimes called the convective piece of the problem. Okay. You don't need to worry about it, but all I want you to remember is that this whole thing together is the acceleration of any fluid particle. Okay, so this is my mass times acceleration over here. And so if I want to write Newton's law, what the entire right hand side is essentially forces. And I just put this tilde sign over there because this is really force per unit volume, because I'm writing this for a blob of fluid. I'm really thinking about what are the forces that are acting per unit volume of this blob. Okay. So again, in these forces, as you can see, that there are two pieces. Okay. The first piece is a gradient. So this is the gradient operator acting on a pressure. So P is my pressure. And you can think of this in an intuitive way. Okay. So before going to any sort of mathematics, you can think that you take a beaker of water, or you take a glass of soda, you put a straw, and you suck the fluid up, and the way you are doing this is by creating a pressure gradient, right? You create a differential of pressure, that's why things flow. And that's exactly what happens in pipes. So if you have flow through a pipe, you have difference in pressure, and that's why the fluid is flowing. So it sort of makes sense that there will be some term like gradient of pressure. And it's really the gradient that matters, because it doesn't matter if I have high pressure but identical pressures on two sides. It's only the pressure difference that's going to drive or move fluids. So it makes sense that there is some stuff like gradient of pressure showing up over here. The other property that I want to talk about pressure is that it is, if you take a volume element like this, it is always going to act normally to the surface. Okay. So that's this term, pressure. So if as a result, since it's acting normally, as you can imagine, that if pressure was uniform, it was a constant, then there is no net force on this object, and this is not going to move around. Okay. So now let's talk about the other piece, and this is the piece coming from viscous stresses. So what does that mean? So this is something, again, you guys studied in some version in class 12, which is that suppose I take a plate and I move it with some velocity u. And this is a wall that's fixed. Let's say this height is z, and there is some fluid sitting inside. Okay. And this is the area of the plate is A. So if I'm going to pull this, I need to apply a force, right? Now when I'm pulling, I need to apply a force because the motion of this plate is going to get resisted by the motion of the fluid. So this is something that we again experience, sort of have an intuitive experience, that whenever we say that, we can say that, oh, there is a lot of drag, there is air drag and so on. So we have some intuition of drag, but this is really the resistance or the friction coming from the fluid. That's how you can think about it. Okay. And then there is this sort of experimentally verifiable law for most fluids, and all the fluids that I'm going to talk about, is that the forces that by which you need to pull this plate, if you need to move it with velocity u, they look of the following form. So what this means is that it depends on the gradient of the velocity. By gradient, I mean u over z. It's proportional to the viscosity of the fluid, which is a property of the fluid. And this is the area through which this force is acting. This is the area of the plate. Or in other words, I can sort of identify this as some stress, which is force per unit area. And this stress itself, more formally, as you know, this is something that studied, is given by this following expression. This is sort of Newton's laws of viscosity. Okay, so this is proportional to the viscosity, and then this is proportional to the gradient of the velocity. Now you can ask that why the gradient is showing up, why not just the velocity? Again, just think about it from an intuitive perspective, is that if you have two fluid layers that are moving with the same velocity, then there is sort of no friction between these two layers. You have friction only when there is relative motion between each other, right? So if there are layers of fluids that are moving the same direction with same velocity, there is no stresses that you will develop, there is no friction that you will develop. However, if there are velocity differences or the gradients of velocity, then you will develop a stress or friction, and this law tells you that that's proportional to this velocity gradient, and the proportionality constant is this material property, viscosity. Okay? Any sort of question?
Why is it the Laplace?
Okay, that's a good point. So this is, I'm really doing this for a 1D setup. What you can imagine, so one thing you can imagine, if you do this for a 1D problem, then there will be a derivative that looks like del z. So this will show up as del z of the stresses. So if you do balance in a small box, like we did in the sort of the reading material, is the difference, just like the pressure, is the difference of the stresses that are going to matter to drive things. And the difference of the stresses will look like del z of the stress, and that will give you something like d2u dz2. Okay? But of course, there are other pieces, and this is for a 1D problem. If you do it in 3D, then all the other pieces will show up. That's sort of the heuristic argument. Okay? I mean, this is really not rigorous. You can write down sort of a stress tensor and derive that in a formal way, but there's just rough intuition that that term is encoding friction between fluid layers. Okay. So can you tell me what is the unit of viscosity? What is the dimension or units, anything? Okay, so let's maybe write down the dimension. What is viscosity? Kg per
second.
Pascal per seconds or Pascal times seconds? Pascal into seconds. How will you figure that out from here? So this is force. This is the units of forces. This is area. So this is force, dimensions of force per unit area, right? So this is Pascal, force per unit area. This is my viscosity. What is the dimension of du dz? U has the dimensions of velocity divided by a length. What is the dimension you get? So this is, sorry? Time inverse. Okay, that's what you get out of this, right? And so then you multiply this side. So Pascal seconds is mu, and I will just write this. This is, you can verify this. And of course, like you said, it is Pascal seconds in SI. What is the viscosity of water in Pascal seconds? Does anyone know how viscous water is?
1 into 10 to the power minus.
Minus. Okay, that's not quite correct. I think I know what you're hinting at. There is another quantity called kinematic viscosity, but we'll come to that later. It's 10 to the power minus 3 Pascal seconds. So this is mu water. Okay. Okay. This is something that we should remember for this course, because all the stuff are going to be in water. Okay. So that's about this piece. That's the Navier-Stokes equation. And now let's come back analyzing the Navier-Stokes equations a bit more. So the point that I will make is that this is really the equation that's governing almost all the fluid flows that we are seeing around us. So it's governing the fluid flows that's happening right now in this moment because of the air conditioner I'm speaking. That's Navier-Stokes equations. It governs the fluid flows that happens on the ocean. If you have hurricanes, that's Navier-Stokes equation. If you have a galaxy, that's plasma, that's Navier-Stokes. Also flows inside cells, microorganism, that's Navier-Stokes. It's quite remarkable and almost ridiculous that this set of PDEs are governing everything. But you know from your intuition that flows look very different at different scales. Okay. So the best example is that go to your kitchen, open the tap, you see water flowing down. Now if you want to fry something, pour some oil. The flow of oil doesn't resemble the flow of water. It looks very different because we know that oil is typically more viscous than water. That you sort of have a feeling or intuition about. So there is clearly different physics happening at different length scales and time scales and so on. And what we want to figure out is what is that quantity that differentiates physics at different scales. Okay. So if I have a problem, if I have a physical problem, before solving the PDEs, can we try to figure out which terms of these governing equations are at dominant play? Okay. That's a task that we are trying to achieve. So let's do this for the context of a problem. Suppose I have some object of length L, and there is some flow happening past it. There is some fluid flows happening. Maybe there is some velocity scale u, and the density of the fluid is rho, viscosity is mu. Okay. So now this is something that we are going to do throughout this course. As you will see, we are going to do what I would call scaling. And the scaling process, what you want to do is that you don't want to really solve the equations, but you want to get a sense of the orders of magnitude of the terms that are showing up in your equation. Okay. So if there is a problem like this, you can say that there is a natural length scale in the problem. That's L. That's my length scale for the problem. There is a velocity scale for the problem, which is this capital U. And you can combine these things together to get a time scale in the problem. That's L over U. So let's again take a physical example and try to figure out how will you get L, U, and L, these things. So let's take the context of you take a cup of coffee and you want to stir it. Okay. So what's the relevant length scale you think in that problem is? Diameter of the cup, size of the spoon, that's the length scale, some centimeters. What's the velocity in that context? The velocity of the spoon, the rate at which you stir. Okay, fine. So you now know L and U, and you know the density and viscosity of these things, and so now you're in a position to infer what are the orders of magnitude of these terms in the problem. Okay, so how we do that is that you take a small parcel of fluid and ask what is the estimate of mass times acceleration in that fluid. Okay, mass times acceleration per unit volume. So essentially you're trying to estimate the left hand side of this PD. So what you do is that these are going to call inertial forces. I will just write inertial forces. Inertial. So density is density, rho. And if I want to compute acceleration of a fluid parcel, I need to compute del U del T. What is del U del T in sort of scaling? It's going to be what? Rho times. What's the rough orders of magnitude of this term? U squared by L. That's correct, but let's do it step by step. So it's U over T. Is this okay with everyone? It is roughly U over T. But I know what T is. So I just do rho U squared. That's this term, right? Okay. How about this term? How about this term? So let's call it viscous. How about that term? Well, there is a mu sitting there. What is the Laplacian of U look like in scaling? How does it go like? Sorry? U over L squared. Is it clear to everyone why it is U over L squared? So Laplacian, remember the Laplacian is something like something of this sort, right? So there are two derivatives. So that's L squared, and the velocity scale is U. Is this okay? Okay, so maybe now we can compare what is the ratio of these two things. Okay, let's compare that. So inertial forces or viscous forces, and that's what? If you do this, that's what you will get. Is this okay? And of course, since both of them had units of forces per unit volume, what you got at the end is something that's dimensionless, right? It doesn't have any dimension. There's just one parameter which doesn't have any dimension, and we're going to call this the Reynolds number, RD. So what the Reynolds number is really measuring, it's measuring the strength of the left-hand side compared to the strength of the right-hand side, or the viscous forces. How dominant are the inertia compared to the viscous stresses or viscous forces in the problem, or friction in the problem. Is this okay? Fine. So maybe what we can do is that we can try to figure out some Reynolds number of some typical things and see where our estimate lies. So since we are going to we will talk about swimming or motion in fluids. Let's think about swimming. And let's say, what is the Reynolds number of a well? So we'll guess that. Anyone? First, maybe you can tell me whether it's large or small, or what do you think is the number? Of a well, of a big fish, like a sperm well or a blue well. Yeah. Really large. And anyone else, like, what do you think? What do you think is the number? Should be large or small? Large? Large? Okay. So maybe we can do that, okay? So I will do every example in water. So for water, I know what rho is, the density of water. I know what mu is. So maybe we just first compute what is rho over mu. So rho for water is 1000. And mu is, we just said it's, so rho over mu it's 10 to the power 6. That's a very large number. So let's put it. So maybe I'll just do it here. So Reynolds is really 10 to the power 6 times U times L. So this is Reynolds in water, okay? This is H2, if you want to call it. So now maybe we can do the well problem. What's the rough length of a well? What's the rough order of magnitude of a well? Any number, just you don't need to be specific. 30 meters. So let's make it 10 meters. Let's make our life simpler. Okay, 10 meters. So L is 10. What is roughly the velocity? Any estimate for it? 1 meter per second. 1 meter per second is actually a good estimate. And also it's good for, because all tens, ones are good. So Reynolds for a well is roughly 10 to the power 7. That's a very large number. It's not an order 1 number. And clearly you can see that these terms of the equations are way more important than these terms over here. It's really dominated by what you can call inertia in the problem. Okay, fine. So let's see, what's the Reynolds number of Michael Phelps? What do you think? What do you think? Is it high, low, or where does he stand? 10 power 6. Okay, that sounds like a good estimate, right? He's roughly 2 meters. Okay, he swims very fast. 10 to the power 6 is fine. Okay, so Reynolds Phelps is 10 to the power 6. So he's also a high Reynolds guy. What do you think is the Reynolds number for me if I swim? It's really worse than Phelps for sure, because my velocity will be factors of hundreds less probably. But what's the rough order? It's going to be large or small? It will be smaller, but how small? Is it more than 1, like order 1 or order 1000 or order 10,000? Where do I stand? Similar order, right? So I will just say that Reynolds normal human is 10 to the power 4. So we are all high Reynolds people. We are all high Reynolds number objects. So that's the world we live in. So that's really what I want to highlight. This is the world that we observe. This is the world that we are living in every day. This is the world that you're facing when you're biking, swimming, everything. Okay, so now let's do this other problem. There are microorganisms or unicellular organisms. Let's start big. These are called paramecium. They live in fresh water. They're ciliates. They're roughly hundreds of microns large. That's roughly their cell size. So it's a pretty large cell. 100 micron for a cell is pretty large. Typical sizes of cells are 15, 30 microns. So 100 is quite large. And it moves with some velocity which is orders millimeters per second. So now let's estimate what's the Reynolds number for a ciliate. What do you think is this a Reynolds number? Can anyone tell me?
It will be order of magnitude smaller than almost 10 to the power of 2 smaller.
So let's compute it. So U is millimeters per second, so this is 10 to the power 6 times 10 to the power minus 3. That's millimeters per second. And my length is hundreds of microns, so that's right. Okay, so it's roughly order 0.1, right? So now you see that you have immediately now transitioned to a world ciliate is order 0.1. It's roughly 0.1, and that's sort of the world where now this term over here has become less important compared to these terms that are governing the equations. So this is the terms that have now started to dominate and not inertia. So it's viscosity or friction that starts to dominate and not the inertial stuff. Okay. So let's do one more example. Okay. What about something like E. coli? Okay. So E. coli is, I didn't draw this correctly, right? So this is roughly how E. coli looks. You have this flagella. They rotate it and they swim. Okay, so what is the rough order of magnitude of length, do you think, for E. coli? Orders of what? Micrometers. Now you're really in the orders of tens of microns. So maybe let's make it tens of microns order. And the velocities are again orders of tens of microns of seconds. Okay, so now what is the Reynolds number for this guy? What's 10 to the power 6? What do I get? So I have 2 10 to the power minus 6 will show up for micrometers. So that will give me 10 to the power minus 6, but then 100, so it's 10 to the power minus 4, right? So now this is really small. Now this is way far from your order 1 term. And really, these terms are not going to be important anymore. You've now conclusively said that these are the things that are way larger, because remember, it's the ratio of the inertial forces to the viscous forces. If this is very small, then you can have very large viscous forces. So these terms are not going to be important. And so that's the limit, or that's the world that we're going to think of. Okay? So one example that I didn't really do, but I thought I will just mention because this was in the video lecture, is that in this sort of swimming problems, what I did is that I varied the swimming speed U and the length L. And that's how I sort of went down from being at high Reynolds number to being at low Reynolds number. But you can have situations where the length is very large, but still it's a low Reynolds number problem. Can anyone give me an example when that can happen? Yes, correct. So you have to have very high viscosity, low density, or yeah, that's correct. Or you can have very low velocity and very large length scale. Is there a physical context where you've seen that very slow velocity but large length scales?
Sir, in plate tectonics?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's exactly that's the right answer. It's tectonics or glaciers, things like that. They have very large length scales, but the velocity is very small, right? So they're again in the low Reynolds number world, but they're very different. I mean, this is not the same set of way you go to that Reynolds number. Its velocity is fundamentally different. Okay, so So let's just use what we have so far, and let's now go to the world of lower Reynolds number. So what I will do is that I will just rewrite the governing equations and make our life simpler by saying, so these are the Stokes equations. And now the equations are this. So I've disappeared all those terms that involved time derivative, u dot grad u, all the nonlinear things that were there in the equations, they have disappeared. And you're left with much simpler PDEs. They look very simple and they're together called the Stokes equation. I've still retained the assumption that the divergence of the velocity should be 0, and that's all we are going to deal with. So it's incompressible fluid, and this is the momentum balance. So we'll just make one side comment, is that you see that I didn't get rid of the pressure. I didn't say anything about the pressure actually throughout this argument. There are sort of subtle reasons why the pressure should be there, but without going to sort of math reasons, I give you a physical argument. Even if you're at low Reynolds number, you can do this whole experiment of driving fluid with pressure gradients, right? So if you take a syringe, which is a very thin diameter, and slowly suck a fluid that's very viscous, you're driving it by pressure gradient, so the pressure gradient should be there. Okay, that's sort of an intuitive understanding why it should be there, but there's more rigorous reasons for why it should be there. But for now, we just take that the pressure should be there. Okay, so that's our governing equations. Okay, so what we will do is that in order to understand locomotions or problems in low Reynolds number, we need to understand certain properties of these equations. Okay? So let's write down, I will write down certain properties and explain what I mean by them. Okay. So first, can anyone tell me, so these are PDEs, right? These are partial differential equations. Can anyone tell me whether these are linear or nonlinear equations? Everyone agrees with that statement? Okay, so they're linear equations. So let's write that. That's first property. So they're linear. And if you have linear equations, what it means is that if you get two solutions, one is pressure and one is velocity. Suppose you have two solutions for the Stokes equation, then you can do a linear combination of these guys and construct another solution. Okay, everyone on board with that? Okay, so that's a linear. Perfect. Now let's ask the sort of the non-obvious question: what is strange about this equation? So what is the thing that sort of is weird and odd about these equations? I mean, of course, these equations are nice because I had this whole left-hand side that was sitting there, those nonlinear terms and everything, they have disappeared. They are linear equations. We love linearity. But there is something strange happening with these equations. Can anyone sort of guess or point out? Yes. Yeah, so there is a response, right? There is no time in this equation. Now let's take a moment for that. Okay? That's really odd. Because when we start learning differential equations in school or anywhere, or even last week, like when we were doing Akshit's class, right? Differential equation by definition, you think about dynamics, right? It's describing something that's evolving, moving, going forward. And whenever you think about dynamics, and particularly if you're thinking about fluid flows, which are things moving around, you'd think that there should be time. I mean, dynamics with respect to what? Time should be there, right? But now time is not there in these equations. So that's really strange. Okay, so these are describing dynamics of flows, but there is no time. And throughout in Akshit's class, you never encountered a system where there was no time. And all the population dynamics that you guys did, there was always time, right? So what does this mean if I don't have time in this equation? What? Okay, that's correct. So this is some sort of quasi-steady state problem, but the fluid needs to flow, right? Fluid needs to move. So if it is steady and then it's not moving, then it's not interesting, right? How will it move? How will the fluid move?
U already has the flow.
I need to solve for U. I don't know what U is, right? U is still this. I will also write time. So just think about it this way, okay? Suppose there is a silicon oil, okay, which is extremely viscous. Okay? It's 1,000 times more viscous than water. And now I get into that oil and I move. So I'm going to move the fluid around, right? So there has to be a velocity field for that, which you need to still compute. So what does it mean to not have time in equation? Right, okay. So I'll give you sort of the hint and answer, is that what it means to not have time in equations is that it means that there are problems that are fundamentally driven by boundaries. So I will explain what I mean by that. So suppose you take a chalk, okay? So it's now resting, it's not moving. I push it. Now I've removed my force, but it keeps moving, right? These guys keep moving. Why is it moving? And the property by which it is moving is called what? It's called inertia. So inertia encodes a memory in certain ways, that it remembers that, oh, I was moving, so I must keep on moving. Of course, it will stop because of friction at some point, but it will keep on moving for a bit. But here I have got rid of that inertia. So fluid doesn't have any memory. It doesn't know that it was moving. It will only move if I push it to move. Okay. Let me give you another example. Suppose you solve this equation. Some oscillator, or some particle, this is mass times acceleration, this is some damping, okay? So this is some friction, and this is the forcing by which you're doing. Of course, you can, if I tell you what F is, you know a method, you can solve this and you can look at what happens to it. Now suppose, instead I tell you that the governing equation is not this, but it is this. Now this is a weird equation, right? Because of course I know what x dot is. X dot is nothing but F over C. And if I apply a force, this guy will move. But the moment I stop applying the force, its velocity is 0. It immediately comes to rest. It doesn't do anything. It just stays there. This is not true for this guy, right? If I apply the force, it starts moving. Remove the force, it will still keep moving for a bit before it comes to rest because of this guy. But it will move, right? Here this doesn't happen. So this is really the world we are living in. And the fluid only moves if you drive things through boundary. Okay? So I will just write it. The mathematical statement for this quantity is called boundary value problems. So really things move and things you can solve is by forcing through boundaries. Okay? And this is like, or it's said that these are essentially quasi-steady problems. You're moving the boundary, the fluid is moving. You stop moving, the fluid is at rest. Nothing happens to the fluid. It's a really strange world. Okay, this is not something that we're used to every day. So in the context of fluid, if I want to give you this example, it should be the following, that I take a cup of coffee, again I put my spoon, and then I stir it. But if I stop stirring, you know that the coffee will keep spinning for a bit. But if you take a silicone oil, do this experiment. If you find very viscous oil, take a stirrer and just stir it and then stop. And you will see immediately the whole thing is stopping. Nothing is moving. So that's the world that we're trying to model. Okay? So things happen, things can evolve in time only if you change the forcing in the boundary. Just like this. This particle can have dynamics in time if you keep changing force with respect to time, right? If you change the force, the velocity will change with time. But this happens instantaneously. So that's the world that we're living in. So together with these two, let's first, I will list down more properties. Let's first examine what it means to swim in this fluid. Okay, so let's just do this calculation for this fluid.
So this is for only high viscous friction.
Okay, so this is, okay, that's a good question. This is for flows which are at low Reynolds number. So in the flows where the inertial terms are not important compared to the viscous terms. So now it can happen because the viscosity of the fluid is very high. It can happen because the length scales of the problems are very small. It can also happen if the velocities are very small. So it could be a combination of all those things, right? And I won't say just high viscous, but of course, if you want to think about an intuitive experiment that you can do at a lab scale, it has to be a high viscous fluid. If you want to do an experiment on the tabletop, it has to be a high viscous fluid. Okay. So let's just do one problem, just exactly like this, and ask the following. Suppose there are two things I'm going to do. Suppose there is a guy, and then there is a bacterium. Both of them are swimming. And at some point, this guy stops swimming. By stop swimming, I mean, suppose this guy was performing, say, freestyle motion, and it just stops paddling. So it's not swimming. But you can imagine that since it was moving, just by the virtue of inertia, this guy will move some distance, like it is going to coast some distance. Same for this guy. So this guy is moving, and suddenly this guy says, now I won't swim anymore, and let's see how far I go with the inertia that I had. So let's compute what is the distance you will go if you suddenly stop swimming. Is the question clear? Okay, so let's do that. So again, we'll do this by scaling, okay? So my governing equation is ms, s for swimmer, not for the fluid, mass of the swimmer times dv dt to the forces that are acting. Right. So what I will do is, again, the idea is just like we do in scaling. So suppose this guy has some velocity u, this guy has some velocity u. First, let us estimate how long does this guy swim before it comes to a stop. So can I write this? Is this okay with everyone? Tau is the stopping time. Is this okay? So this is again a scaling argument, okay? I'm not doing anything rigorous here. I'm just trying to estimate the orders of magnitude of when this will happen. So I have a scale for velocity, that's u. I don't know what the scale for time is, that's what I want to compute, let's call this tau. And then there is some scale of forcing. Okay? Okay with everyone? Okay, then what I will do is that I can rearrange this and write that tau is ms u over f. And let's write this as so where rho s is the density of the swimmer and length is the length scale. Is this okay? Sounds good? Okay, so if this is the time estimate of how long I swim, what is the distance I will go? Well, the distance is simply tau times u. That's my scales for the problem. Like, and this is going to be rho s L cubed u squared over f. Is this okay? So let's compute what d is now. Okay. So I will compute first the d for the bacterial. So all I need to compute d is I need to tell you what f is. And I know that in this world of low Reynolds number, we just proved earlier that it is the friction forces from the fluid that dominates. So I have an estimate for this f. What is the estimate for f? Well, mu times velocity is, you can convince yourself, remember stress is mu times velocity over length, right? So force is mu times velocity times length. Because, let me just do this. Tau is mu u over L squared. So force, which is tau times tau times L squared is mu u L. And this you can check by dimension. So mu has dimensions of Pascal seconds. This is dimensions of meter per second. This is dimensions for meters. So these are meter squared. Pascal times meter squared gives you force. And then seconds and seconds cancel. So these are the dimensions of forces. Okay. So what is d bacterium? Well, it is rho s L cubed u squared over mu u L. I can cancel, this becomes 2. So then I can write this as this. So let's check. Did everyone follow what I did over here? So what I did is that I divided by the density of the fluid So I multiplied by the density of the fluid. Didn't do anything really. This became L squared. I just took one L outside, and then I've written rho F Lu over mu. Is this clear to everyone? This is manipulation. I haven't done anything so far. What is this number that's sitting over there? Okay, that's Reynolds. So maybe I can write this. dB over L is rho S over rho fluid times Reynolds. So now you sort of see what's going to happen, okay? Or maybe let's just write this. Okay, now suppose I'm E. coli. The density of E. coli and density of water is roughly same. So this is some order 1 quantity. What is the Reynolds we estimated for E. coli? What's the Reynolds? So this is 10 to the power minus 4. What is the length scale that we also estimated for E. coli? What's roughly the length scale? It's tens of microns. 10 to minus 5. So what is this? Is 1 nanometer. So imagine that you are a bacterium, you're swimming in a fluid, and then you decide that I'm tired, I won't swim anymore, I will just coast with the fluid. Well, you're not going to go anywhere. The moment you stop swimming, the distance you will go before you completely stop is 1 nanometer. So that's nothing. So essentially, immediately you stop swimming, you immediately stop. And that's really what we have been encoding over here, is that fluid only really moves, things only really move if you keep driving them. If you don't drive them, nothing moves and everything is stationary, you stop. Is this clear, what's happening?
Sir,
Yeah.
so here the dynamics is captured by the pressure gradient. Like the indirect time dynamics is captured by the pressure gradient here.
So the time dynamics is captured by everything, right? I mean, once the bacteria stops swimming, there are forces acting on it, and the forces come from resistance from the fluid, right? So you can think of this F being the drag force coming from the fluid, and it has contributions from both viscous stresses and pressure. So you're right about that. One thing that I didn't really discuss is that for these equations to hold true, when you're saying that two terms add up and gives you 0, the pressure and this term has to be of the same order, right? The pressure cannot be very different from this guy and vice versa. So they are all on the same order. So what we estimated over here will work perfectly fine if you estimate with pressure, as long as you're doing the right scaling for the pressure. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
And any other question? Do you think this is true if we swim in the fluid? Do you think this is true? So we will move if we stop swimming? We will, right? So what will change? I mean, this so far up to here there was no assumption of anything. What will change if we if we do this experiment? Some estimate of something has to change, right, for this to happen. So let's do D human. Or what is the thing that's going to change? Can anyone guess? The Reynolds number has changed, correct? But in this expression, once we computed D bacterium, what is the thing that we had to input? Up to here, we didn't say anything about bacteria or human. We said something about a quantity to get to that. What was the quantity that we estimated from Stokes equations? We estimated the force. We said something about the forces. And remember, the forces are very different if I swim, right? It's not a low Reynolds number flow. So the forces that act on me, they look very different. They're not going to be the same orders as these guys. So someone has a question about pressure. It's actually a very good question because those are the dominant forces that are showing up when you are swimming in the swimming pool. And that's again in the rough same orders of magnitude as the inertial forces, or mass times acceleration. So I will just tell you what the force is that's not the point of the class. I will just tell you how the forces look like. If you are inertial flow, okay, so things look like this. This is how the force scale will look like. Okay, so this is, for those of you who have sort of remember Bernoulli's equation and things like that, In Bernoulli's equation, you have things like P plus rho U squared. So pressure grows as sort of rho U squared, and then you multiply it by the length squared to get the force. So that's, I'm not really justifying where this comes from, but that's rough scale. So if you put it back and do the calculation, I won't do it, you will find dH, or d human, will go as rho swimmer divided by rho fluid times length. So it will turn out to be, simply just do this calculation, and you can do it at your home, and this is really what you will get. So this is really going to be the density of the swimmer, the density of the fluid, times the length of the swimmer. That's the distance you will go. And clearly this is not going to be 1 nanometer. There's going to be some finite distance. And that's, of course, an experience that we have in swimming pool. If we push from the wall, and then we're not doing anything, we're just staying afloat, we'll coast, right? You're not going to sink or stop immediately. But the bacteria will just stop immediately. They just won't go anywhere. Okay. Sorry?
For equivalent ratio of the density.
For here, yeah, so there is a ratio of density, correct? And then there is Reynolds number multiplying length.
So that does not.
So okay, so that will appear, you are correct. I just assume that the bacteria that was swimming, that's roughly density matched with water. So it's like you're not thinking about floating and other things, your density matched and neutrally bound. And then it's really Reynolds times length. As opposed to if I'm density watts, if say I'm swimming in Dead Sea, so I'm density matched with the salt water, say. So then this is order 1, then I will swim a distance of my body length roughly, if I stop doing anything. And kind of nice results, the nice estimate of the scaling, I don't know whether you appreciate this, is that this really doesn't depend on whether you're a very good swimmer or a bad swimmer. Like in Reynolds number, if of course Michael Phelps is taller than me, but if we were of the same height, you know, and we did this experiment, we will do equally bad or equally well. It doesn't matter, right? Okay, so that's the strangeness of this world that we are living in. Okay, so let's get to the next property of things, and that's again something that you guys did in class 11 and 12, but I will just recall that over here. Do you guys remember Stokes' drag? Stokes' drag, terminal velocity of a falling sphere. Remember this problem, right? Everyone did this. So let me write down the property and then I will go. Let's do that problem. Let's revisit that problem once more and we'll see how it is related to that. So what was the problem? We had a sphere with some density, that's rho s, sitting in some fluid. The fluid has density rho f. Say it's water and say it's an iron sphere, it's going to sediment, it's going to fall, correct? And the calculation, if you remember correctly, then you'll find that there was this calculation of what you call the terminal velocity. It's a velocity or it's a state where the drag forces or the forces acting on the sphere from the fluid perfectly balances the forces that are pulling it down, or the forces from gravity or buoyancy, what you want to call it. So let's compute what is the force that wants to pull it down. Let's compute that. So let's just, so say this is z direction. Say there is gravity. I want to compute what is the forces that's pulling it down. What is F? So it is, let's write it this way. Because the mass of the sphere times, is it G? I mean, it's sitting in a fluid, so there has to be buoyancy. So it displaces the volume of the fluid, which is same as its volume, right? So it's going to displace that. So how much volume does it displace? Maybe it's better to write in terms of volume. So 4/3 pi, let's call the radius to be A. Okay, that's correct. So that's the difference of the density. That's rho sphere minus rho fluid acting in the direction. Oh, there has to be a gravity somewhere, right? Is this okay? Remember this space? So this is a force which is pulling down the sphere. But there is another force that's acting on the sphere. What is that force? The drag. Does everyone remember this? That there's a drag force acting? Which direction is the drag force acting? Upwards, fine. Okay, so there is an F drag. Let's say what F drag is. Now, does anyone remember what F drag is? If it is moving with some velocity, constant velocity, u. Okay, you guys remember this, so it's great. So 6 pi eta is viscosity, I will call it mu, a times u times z hat. So all I would do is now say that when it's falling with a constant velocity, terminal velocity, there is no acceleration. So my Newton's law should look like this. F, let's call this g, fg plus fd equal to 0. Right? That's all it should happen. And of course, now you can arrange and solve this. What you find is the following, right? You say 6 pi mu a du is equal to 4/3 pi a cubed. Let's call this delta rho times g. So if you rearrange this stuff, you find u to be what? 3, so it's 29 a squared by mu delta rho g. That's what you find, right? Okay. This is okay. This is just really redoing what you guys did in class 12 or 11. Okay, so suppose I do the experiment in an oil, and if this is an iron sphere, it will sediment, it will fall down. What happens if I do this experiment with a ping pong ball, which is way less dense compared to the oil? What will happen? It will of course not fall down. So, but I still want to measure this velocity for a ping pong ball. It will go up. So what we can do is that we can take a tank of oil and release the ball from the bottom, and then we'll go up. So if I change the sign of delta rho, so for that case, what you're doing is effectively you've changed the sign of delta rho, right? If you just flip the sign of delta rho, right now rho s is greater than rho f, but if you do the opposite, nothing changes. Nothing in this problem changes if the viscosity and the radius are the same. Doesn't matter whether it's what is it called? Whether it's an iron ball or anything, all it depends on delta rho. As long as the delta rho is fixed, doesn't matter if you change the sign, it will just go up. It will all it just do, it will change the sign of u. It's okay. So when doing this, you did two important things. Sort of subtly you did this, but let me point out the first one. Is that you said that there is a relationship between the drag forces and the velocity of the object. You said that. Now tell me, where did this relationship come from? How did you know that this is the right relation? Is this something trivial or is this something non-trivial? Okay, so it's a fairly non-trivial problem now, right? You see that this is something that we use, but now it's a non-trivial problem. You're saying that you have to solve for the velocity field past a sphere and then compute this thing. This is a hard problem. It's not something trivial. But really, one thing that's sort of interesting in this relationship, that there is a linear relationship between the velocity and the drag forces. So let's just highlight that. So force, just for the sphere, force is 6 pi mu a u. And let me just box this piece. I will talk about that later. So if you just increase, you take the sphere, just increase the velocity by a factor of 2, the force will go up by a factor of 2. Right? It's really proportional to velocity. And as you can sort of guess, that this is a consequence of the fact that the equations are linear. If the equations were not linear, you won't have this relationship. But here things are really, you're just doubling one thing and the other thing also doubles. So there is a linear relationship between force and velocity. And now there sits a prefactor sitting in front, and this prefactor is really function of geometry. Right? Here, this is the prefactor, is of course this function of the property of the fluid, that makes sense. It's function of viscosity, but really a function of the geometry. It doesn't depend on anything else. You tell me the size of the sphere, I know what the drag force is, or the geometry prefactor. Is this okay? So in general, and again, let's see what the time, we can do it a bit more in a general context, in the sense that if you have any arbitrary object, it doesn't need to be sphere, any shape, and if you drag this shape with some velocity u, and you want to compute what is the force acting on this object. Of course, computing that could be non-trivial, just like it's non-trivial here. Computing force on a sphere is a non-trivial problem. This is also a non-trivial problem, but you can say something. You can say that the force, whatever force that I need to apply, has to be proportional to the velocity. So this is, again, a property of this regime. This is the property of Stokes' equation. This is property here. And this is not true if you are in the other limit, the inertial regime. Then forces are not proportional to velocities. Okay. Here, this is true. Okay. And I won't go into the details, but you can sort of show why that had to be the case, because the stress tau that I was writing down, that's linearly related to velocity. And the stress is directly related to forces. So the stress is proportional to the velocity, and it's a velocity driving flows, then they are all should be linearly related. That's sort of the heuristic argument. Is this okay?
This force is the drag force.
This force is a drag force. Okay, so that's another good question, and let me point to that. So you're absolutely right. This is the drag force from the fluid on the object. But remember, my governing equation in low Reynolds number, just like I showed you, that as the bacteria moves, there is no terms like mass times acceleration. They really they have no memory, no inertia. They don't move. So my governing equation is always this. F external plus F drag is equal to 0. I don't have mass times acceleration. So, like you said, you're absolutely correct. This is the drag force, but this is also the same amount of force by which I have to pull it. So if I'm pulling it, just like in the sphere problem, right? You balance these two forces. They must be equal. Okay. So now tell me, if I say that I have a vector F and I have a vector U, and they're linearly related, what's the most general linear relationship between two vectors? Tensor. Hey. Okay. Anyone else want to guess? What really? They're parallel. They need not always be parallel. But I mean, this is okay. This is not a fluids question. This is really a math question. So if you have two vectors, and I'm saying that these two vectors are linearly related, what is the most general linear mapping between two vectors? Okay, so scalar can walk. So in the sphere problem, we had a scalar, correct? But is this the most general one? Not, right? Should be some matrix sitting there. It has to be a matrix, right? That's how you could map two vectors. That's the most general mapping, linear mapping between two vectors that I'm thinking of. So there has to be a matrix sitting there. So forces on an object is related to linearly with the velocity, and typically there is a matrix sitting there, and this is called the resistance matrix. Resistance matrix. And now you can imagine that this is really a dual problem, in a sense is that if I tell you what the resistance matrix is, if I measure velocity, then you can tell what the force is, and vice versa, right? If I tell you what the force is, you can just invert this matrix and write it as, so M is nothing but inverse of this matrix R. So M is R inverse. And this is called the mobility. Is this clear? So there are really dual problems. If I know the force, I know the velocity. If I know the velocity, I know the force, provided I know R. Okay,
Sir,
so
excuse me, sir.
yes,
Sir, can the matrix R be a singular matrix?
it cannot be. It cannot be a singular matrix. That's a very good point actually. So your question is, will R always have an inverse? Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so there is sort of more properties on R you can prove that R has to be a symmetric positive definite matrix. Why it has to be that? That's a different discussion, because you can show that, I mean, these things as they move, they need to dissipate energy, and the energy dissipation can only be positive, and from those properties you can prove that R is symmetric positive definite. So no, R is not singular, R will always have an inverse, so there is nothing to worry. But you can think of it, I mean, okay, this is a math statement, but you think of it from an experiment sense, right? If you're moving an object in a fluid, you perform an experiment, you measure the force and know the velocity. What you're saying is that if I measure the velocity, I've now measured forces and now velocity, but if I know velocity, then I don't know the forces. That shouldn't be the case, right? The force should be able to find it. That's sort of the experimental reasoning, but no, the math reason is R is always invertible. So there's nothing to worry about it. Okay? Is this clear? So let's see. Okay, so I think last one thing that I should mention about this matrix R is that, what do you think R is a property of? This is just one thing. Of course, if I'm pulling this object, R is something. If I'm pulling a square, R is something. If I'm pulling this object, R is something. So what is R function of, really? R is purely a geometry function. It doesn't depend on anything else. And for the sphere problem, my R matrix was 6 pi mu A times identity. I can also think of it this way, right? It's an identity matrix problem. So this is really function of geometry and nothing else. Okay? Fine. So I think I will do the last property. We'll go a bit over time, but I think we should do it so we can do biology next time. The last property is really what is called kinematic reversibility, or reversibility in these equations. So this is, did you guys get a chance to watch the video? No, okay. So video was the fun part. Okay, so I'll show you a movie. Maybe I first explain and then I show the movie. Let's do it that way. Okay, so the last point is reversibility. So this is again a subtle point, and it's a very interesting one. And this is the first thing that you will see in the next class when we start doing swimming. This is the first thing that's going to have very serious implications of how one can swim in a viscous fluid. So this is really tied to swimming. And the point here is that we have established the fact that fluid flows in this regime only happen through boundaries, right? We have said if the boundary moves, there is a flow. If nothing is moving, there is no flow. Now let's do this thought experiment. There is a sphere that's moving in this direction. The same problem that we just did, okay? The sedimenting stuff, drag, etc. What if, and say it's moving with a velocity u, what if the sphere starts moving in this direction with the velocity u? So these are two different problems. This is problem 1 and this is problem 2. So let me rephrase the question. As the sphere moves in this direction, it's going to create some flow. Some flow happening around it. And now the sphere is moving in the opposite direction but with the same velocity. My question is, what do you think will happen to the flow? It reverses direction, correct. It has to reverse direction. That sort of makes sense. But will the flow pattern change? No, right? So nothing will happen because you're really driving this flow through the motion of the sphere. If you just change the direction of the motion of the sphere, nothing should change. Right? The flow is going to look identical, but all the particles of the fluid is going to go in the opposite direction. So this is called kinematic reversibility, and this is also happening because there is no time in the equation. So they have no memory what they were doing. The moment you sort of switch the direction of this guy, all the fluid particles start going in the direction. Is this clear? And really the point that I'm trying to make is that the flow pattern is not going to change. The flow pattern is going to look identical, it will just going to reverse.
What is steady state fluid?
So again, so this is all quasi-steady state. Can you explain what you mean by steady state?
If it is not steady state, it is that fluid is not incompressible and density changes, then the fluid pattern will change.
Okay, so there are multiple things. So steady and incompressibility are two different things. So steady flow is when there is no explicitly time showing up in the problem. So that's a steady flow problem. The flow pattern is not evolving with time. That's a flow that I will call steady. Whether a fluid is incompressible or compressible, that has nothing to do with it, right? So for example, you take a cup of coffee, it's water roughly. That's an incompressible fluid, but if you just vigorously shake it, it's going to be unsteady flow, it's changing with time. So those are two different things. Here, as you have sort of rightly pointed out, there is no time. I mean, I wrote time here, but really there is no time in the equation. So the only way the fluid changes with time is if you were moving with a velocity u and now you move with a velocity 2u. Then the fluid flow will change in time, but that's sort of a fake time. It's a time change that's happening because you change the boundary condition of the problem. Okay. So this is really a implication of sort of these two facts coupled with the point that there is no time in this equation. So everything is reversible in Stokes law.
I said the reversibility is true only for row Reynolds case, right?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. So reversibility is only true for low Reynolds. And let me just, since we're close to finishing, let's do one thing now. Let's just show you a movie, okay, of reversibility, and I will explain what it means. Okay. So now I have to connect to Zoom again. So this is the experiment that you're going to see. It's a very famous experiment. It's done by G.I. Taylor, who was one of the greatest fluid dynamicists of all time, and he made a lot of pioneering contributions in fluids and other fields. And see how it looks. Okay. So what you are seeing over here are essentially two concentric cylinders. So I will just draw the picture over here. So there are two concentric cylinders and there is a fluid, okay, in between. And this is I think it's something like glycerin or something that's heavy, highly viscous, okay. And what you're going to do is that I think you're rotating either the inner one, either the outer one. You're going to rotate this outer cylinder, and there are three. These are corn syrup. I think these are three dyes, 3 food coloring. Can you reduce the light a little bit? Perfect. Okay. So these are food coloring. Okay. And what you're going to do is that you're going to rotate the outer cylinder. So what it means is that if you rotate the outer cylinder, you can imagine that there will be some flow like this. There will be some flow like this. Okay. And so these things are going to get mixed, get transported, exactly how you stir in a cup of coffee. So let's see what's happening. So it's going to get okay, so it's not playing online, so let's just wait for a second. Is it working now on Zoom? So there's some problem on Zoom, I think.
Yeah, the camera is having a problem, but you can just.
Oh, this can go on. Okay, perfect. Okay, so as you can see that this whole thing is getting mixed. Okay, so this whole dyes got smeared out. So you have something that's a well mixed stuff, right? Let's just pause this whole thing here for a bit. This is going on. Okay, so she now stops here. So this whole dye that was there, that got spread out, And so now we have this sort of well mixed or well sheared mixture of this dye. Now just think for a second, you take a beaker, put some dye in it, beaker of water, okay, put some dye in it and stir it in one direction. The dye is gone. The whole beaker becomes blue. There is absolutely no way to recover the previous state. There's absolutely no way. You cannot just start in the other direction and the dye magically comes back. It can never happen. But here, it's a bit different, right? So here, you see what it does now it starts rotating in the other direction. As you can see over there, it's actually rotating the inner cylinder, but it's okay. It's rotating the other direction, and we'll see what happens to the dye. Okay, so now you're back, right? So this is exactly the consequence of kinematic reversibility in the problem, because fluid motions in this problem is purely driven by boundaries. There is absolutely no memory. So the moment it stopped, the whole thing stopped. The moment you start reversing, the flow field just reverses identically backwards. It's going to the whole particles of flows. Remember, the velocity field is u, so any fluid particle on the fluid moves with this velocity, dx dt is u. So the moment you have reversed u to minus u, all the fluid particles will just trace back their path and come back to this state. They're not going to go anywhere, and this phenomenon is called kinematic reversibility. And so this is the first of the four properties that are going to, I mean, they're all sort of related, but this is really the first property that will have a direct consequence to swimming of microorganisms. And this will restrict certain kinds of swimming which are possible in high Reynolds number, which are possible when we go out for swimming in swimming pools, but it's not possible in the world of low Reynolds number. Okay, so what we'll do is that next time we'll pick up from here. We'll start by discussing locomotion in low Reynolds number. Before I close, there is a don't think of it as a homework, just think of it as a puzzle. Okay, sorry to bother you again. Can I close this? Okay, I think you can see me now, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. So let's do this puzzle. Okay, this is you guys think about it. Suppose there is a rigid rod, iron rod, okay, heavier than the fluid, and of course there is gravity or buoyancy, whatever you want to call it. There is a force that's pulling it down. Okay. The problem or the question that I want to ask, so this is going to of course fall downwards. There is no doubt about that. As it falls downwards, will it rotate? And if it rotates, which direction will it rotate? That's the puzzle. Is the question clear? So what can happen is that you can start here, and as you fall, you can become straight. That can happen. If you can be like this, and you can fall like this. You can rotate like this. Right? You can rotate. So my question is, if it rotates with some angular velocity omega, which direction will it rotate? And yeah, that's the puzzle. Okay, that's puzzle one. Is this clear to everyone? So it's the same medium where these guys were doing the experiment. So it's glycerin or silicon oil, extremely viscous, extremely viscous. So in short answer, it's low Reynolds number problem. Okay, you're in this regime, and this is the puzzle that you have to solve. And really, again, I will just give you the hint. The whole solution relies on the fact that things are reversible. So whatever you come up with has to be tied to this reversibility. I will give you a second puzzle that looks almost similar to this one. Is that there is a wall. Okay, and now there is a sphere. This sphere is sedimenting, same as before. So we just did that problem of 6 pi mu terminal velocity and so on. Same problem, but now there is a wall. Okay. The question is whether the sphere, as it sediments, whether it drifts in this direction or whether it's going to drift in this direction. Is the question clear? So as this guy is sedimenting, will it sediment like this or will it go straight? See, will it sediment like this, or will it sediment like this, or will it sediment like this? Is the question clear to everyone? Okay. So again, answer to this problem is also tied to reversibility. So what we'll do is that next time, which is on Friday, I will just quickly recap these properties. We'll solve these two puzzles, okay? And then we start by swimming, okay? Because we are really in the position now to talk about swimming. We have done everything, all the groundwork, and then we'll see where we go. Okay? Okay, so I will just hang in there. If you have any questions, comments, just let me know.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So, will we also be handed over some readings before the next class?
So you received the last reading, right?
Yes, the fluids intro.
Yeah, that's correct. So, and then there is this video lecture that I also sent you.
Yes.
I think that's all. There is no more reading. That's really all.
Okay.
So, I mean, I would suggest one thing. If you have time, based on what we discussed today, go and reread that sort of notes and see whether you can follow all the steps. That's all.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.